Okay, so we have a nice, relatively short chapter on secondary data. That was the focus of chapter 8. And we get started by distinguishing between what is primary data versus what is secondary data. So primary data refers to the data collected by researchers using either quantitative or qualitative methodology for their specific purpose, for their study. Secondary data refers to data that was initially collected by other researchers for their own purposes or just by other organizations or institutions for their own purposes. And now it's being used by a different researcher for the purpose of their study. So secondary data is data that you did not collect yourself, that you are now, but that you are nevertheless going to be using to answer and address your research study question. And I give you that little great graphic there. You know, we've already talked about like the, you know, we have begun talking about the different methodology designs that a person can use to collect their own data. You know, chapter 7 discussed questionnaires, you know, which is the instrument used when you are engaging in a survey design. We've discussed experiments, not field experiments yet, but well, not field experiments and lab experiments, you know, precisely, but, you know, experimentation, um, quasi experimentation, experimental designs versus experimental designs. In the next few weeks, we'll be discussing some qualitative methodology. So we'll discuss observation then. So all of that's when you collect your own data. This presentation is going to be about secondary data. So we're going to get in some of those sources, potential sources for secondary data in the upcoming slides. You know, just know that although collecting your own data is often desirable, many times it's just not feasible, and sometimes it's just not necessary. You know, if there is a good data source out there that is accessible and available to you, that works for your question, you know, it just makes sense in terms of, you know, your time, your resources, your costs to use that data as opposed to collecting your own. And so for this reason, secondary data analysis is actually the most common form of methodology employed by sociologists, particularly, you know, your graduate students, your master's and doctoral students, but also your sociologists that are less established in their career, or who maybe because of their teaching commitments have less time to collect primary data. Additionally, secondary data can also just be used to contextualize and supplement your own primary data. So sometimes you will collect your own data, and this is particularly true for people who engage in qualitative methodology. You know, you will collect primary data using qualitative methods, and then you will supplement it using secondary data. And this is a very common way that people engage in mixed methods in designs in particular. So your book goes over some benefits of secondary data analysis. They identify 6. You know, I don't have a whole lot to add here, so a lot of this is just the material from the textbook. But, you know, the first benefit is the availability of information. You know, sometimes our question requires data that is no longer accessible or possible to collect. And so this is certainly true if you are asking any type of socio-historical question where you know, the people are no longer alive, or the phenomena is no longer occurring, and you need to go back and get data about, you know, the past. The second benefit is opportunities for replication. Replication is big in research. It's part of how we establish kind of the validity and reliability of our results. And secondary data analysis makes replication possible in 2 different ways. One way is that we can collect primary data exactly like the original study. But then the other way is that we can use the secondary data by simply collecting additional information missing from the original study. So in this way, we're kind of, we're replicating and building at the same time upon the original. The third, protection of participants. So they talk specifically about if you're asking a question related to like sexual assault victims or domestic intimate partner violence victims. We know that it is re-traumatizing to ask people questions about these experiences. So as opposed to you collecting this data from yourself and potentially re-traumatizing these individuals, some of the answers that you are, to the questions you have might be found in, data that was collected by, the police, or data that was collected by, the hospital or nonprofit agencies. And so, that's one benefit of secondary data analysis. Or another one is time effectiveness, which I've already kind of just touched on. Collecting primary data, whether quantitative or qualitative, takes time. Qualitative in particular can take a very long time, but even quantitative, if it's a large scale study with a large sample, can take time. So oftentimes it is just more time effective to use secondary data because it eliminates the time and effort related to data collection and instead allows you to kind of focus more on data cleanup and data analysis. And so for this reason, that's why I said this is part of why this methodology is so popular in the social sciences. The fifth benefit, cost effectiveness. So just like primary data collection is timely, it is also costly. Especially if you are hiring a team of people to assist you, that is salaries, wages that you have to pay. Depending on the type of method that you're using, there just can be costs related to data storage. There can be costs, kind of related to traveling. If the primary data collection involves traveling, there's just your travel costs. So secondary data just eliminates the bulk of these costs. And then finally, large data sets. There are just a lot of really good publicly available large data sets, much larger than what usually an individual researcher has the capacity to even collect on their own. I'm talking about particularly like a lot of the data sets that come out of the government, not just the census, but some of the other governmental institutions as well. And then as your book notes, beyond these kind of common sources for data, because of just the advancements in technology, we can now data mine from so many internet sources. And your book describes this process that they call data scraping, which just really allows you to get all type of information from sources that that are unexpected, that you might not would even think would be possible. So what are these sources for secondary data? As your book notes, there are numerous sources, and one way to distinguish between them there are those that use strict methodological processes, and this would be like your government agencies, your academic institutions, researchers associated with academic institutions or research centers. And then there are sources who may not be as strict in their primary data collection, probably because they're collecting data either not for research purposes. So this would be like if you're using like a business or organization, the internal data that they may collect on their customers, clients, employees, patients, right? They would have a different set of processes and protocols in place than the ones that we necessarily see when, we're engaging in, this strict data collection. But and so this does mean that when you're deciding upon secondary data, They're questions that you need to ask, about the quality of the data, the methodologies used to collect it, as well as just its overall suitability for, the question that you're wanting to answer. And so your book goes over what are some of those questions. You need to ask yourself things like, how is this data collected? What were the characteristics of the population and of the sampling frame? What type of sampling was used? How large was the sampling? How large was the sample? Ask yourself questions about the generalizability and the representativeness of that sample. Just on a logistical tip, you want to make sure that, the primary data is available and accessible. Just because it exists doesn't mean that you can access it or that it's public and free. So sometimes it's not public, and you have to. There's a very elaborate protocol to getting access to it. In some cases, in addition to that, it might come with a cost. And some of those costs are not cheap. And then, in other cases, of course, it's public, but only maybe parts of it are public, and you might have issues with missing data. So you need to just be able to address kind of the logistical questions behind, yes, this data exists, but can I access it? Can I afford to access it? Is it all going to be made available to me? What is being made available? What type of agreements do I need to make with whoever holds the primary data? Because sometimes they will put policies in place around, wanting to make sure that you're going to protect the data. That you're going to store it in a certain place, or in some cases, that you'll give them a certain amount of recognition, in acknowledgement, if you use their data. So those are things that you would have to determine. There's a great chart that your book gives that provides common sources of secondary data. And they kind of go over just some large categories of those sources. They talk about the government statistics. This would be, like I said, your census, but there are also data sets from like the CDC, NIH, HUD, research universities. They have institutes dedicated to data collection in a specific field. Certainly a lot of the UCs, they have these large scale research institutes, and some of those data sets are available for secondary data analysis. Some are public, most aren't. Most require you to reach out to the institution to get permission. And then sometimes it's not even that it is an institute, but just research faculty themselves. You read a great article, and they talk about the data that they're using. You want to ask a very similar question, or you want to replicate it with certain tweaks. It is expected, that you can reach out and ask if their primary data can be used by you, a fellow researcher. Now, of course, they don't have to say yes, and they certainly don't have to say yes, and you can use it for free. But I'm just saying it is not frowned upon to ask. Then there's institutional/organizational data. Universities, as well as other large organizations, they have data that they collect that's not for research purposes. It might just be demographic information related to their students or their employees. It might have to do with, if it's an organization, their customers, buying habits. And so once again, with that organizational, institutional data, oftentimes not publicly available, could potentially be a secondary data source. You have to determine, what types of rules they have around allowing people access. And then finally, online sources. If you read the news stories, it's oftentimes a big thing that social media sites, of course, are collecting user data and they sell it to people. That's part of how they send you targeted ads, and things pop up in your email after you clicked on an ad on Facebook or whatever. So that's one source of online data. But really, almost all websites just have a ready supply of content that can be used as a data source. Because especially if you start thinking about it from a content analysis standpoint, a method, a research method design we haven't discussed yet. But this is when you're analyzing content itself, like um, uh, people's tweets, or you're analyzing headlines of online articles related to a topic, right? That's publicly available content on those sites that, depending on your question, might serve as a form of secondary data. It was data, it's sources that weren't created for research purposes, but might serve the purpose of your research dependent on your question. And so, yeah, I already mentioned they gave you that great table that, identifies, among others, Pew Research Center, U.S. Census Bureau, the Mayo Clinic, the World Health Organization, Driven Data, Kaiser Permanente, and they provide you websites. This is a good source for you to use and to think about when completing the activity related to secondary data sources. Although, of course, that table, that's just a list of just a handful, because like I want to just keep emphasizing that, especially when you're thinking about online sources, it's really just numerous options available to you. And this is just a little graphic just saying, especially if you were like, which ones are available to me without me having to jump over a lot of hurdles to access them or pay money, then figuring out the ones that are open access, publicly available, determining if any of those sources have data that works for your question, can really just save you a lot of time and money, energy and headache. Now, it isn't all roses when it comes to secondary data analysis. There are some disadvantages. One disadvantage is, the uncertainty of the constructs. You did not create these constructs yourself. You did not conceptualize them. You did not decide upon the measurements. All of those are decisions that you get to make when you collect primary data. When you use, secondary data, how they are measuring, how they're defining a construct may not align with the purpose and needs of your study. And then you have to kind of decide how big of a deal or not is that. Second major disadvantage, also kind of related to conceptualization and measurement, is the ambiguity of measurement error. Once again, when you are collecting primary data and you are there in that data collection process, you do benefit from insider knowledge about the quality of the measures. You have some sense of, what measures did perhaps, systematically respondents misunderstood. What measures, were there any measures that, did not capture the data in such a fashion that it aligned with how you imagined that it should. These types of measurement errors, when you're using secondary data, are largely going to be unknowable. So that's what they mean by ambiguity of measurement error. Oftentimes you have to just rely on what's called face validity, just kind of accepting, okay, because I have no real way of determining or assessing this, I'm just going to have to take it on its face, that these measurements are valid and reliable. And so that's what face validity is. And this does introduce, unknown measurement error in your own study when you're doing this. And then another disadvantage, but to the extent that this is a disadvantage, is really going to rely on the type of question that you're asking. But is the passage of time. There's the possibility that the data is outdated, or that the measures are capturing phenomena that are now conceived of and thought of differently, and these outdated measures don't accurately reflect that. But as your book notes, this can be also an advantage if what you're interested in is like how a concept changes over time. So really, out of the three disadvantages, you know, the extent to which this one is a disadvantage is really going to be based on the particulars of your question and the type of social phenomena that you are studying. And as promised, this was a relatively short video for a relatively short chapter.